So our area that we live in was settled in the 1720s and 30s by predominantly Scotch, Irish, and German immigrants. And on some of the early maps, let me see, some of the early maps of the area, like this 1770 Nicholas Skull map, you can see the influence of the Irish in this area. And it shows some of the early roads and the townships, and you can see the Presbyterian temples, and of course the Quaker meeting house there. But these are Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. Now, I think a lot of people over the years have mistaken the fact that their relatives are from Ireland with the fact that they're Irish, because in my mind, the Scotch-Irish are not Irish. They're from Ireland, but they're not Irish in the true sense. So the Scotch-Irish are Scots. They come from Scotland. And, they were forced out of pretty much the area of southern Scotland, northern England, into Ireland. And for a few generations, a couple hundred years, their families lived in Northern Ireland. And then, many of them immigrated to North America and other places when they had the opportunity. But they predominantly are a different religion and have a different culture than the Irish. So the Scotch-Irish. Now, you might know a lot of people insist that they're Scots-Irish and not Scotch-Irish. I disagree. I can't tell you how many different times I've heard people say, Scotch is a drink and Scot is a people. And that's not the case. And the Scotch-Irish is the name that they called themselves. And all you had to do is go into a library and look at the histories of those people written by them to see that they call themselves the Scotch-Irish. And the reason I'm adamant about it, have you ever met somebody that's really, really adamant about this? They get really upset. They want you to say Scots-Irish, but I refuse. Anyway, and you know what I've come to believe? I've come to believe that this changing of the name and the spelling of the Scotch-Irish really occurs more from like the 1930s, 40s, and 50s onward. And it seems to me that this group of people is trying to disassociate themselves with drinking. A problem that the actual Irish have no problem with. Or, they don't. But you see this modern change of name. But it is true. And today, in a sense, I would argue that the Scotch-Irish are people that came into the United States generations ago and first settled in this area. And the Scots-Irish are people that came from Scotland. And, more recent. That's like a recent immigrant term. But our area cemeteries are filled with the Scotch-Irish. And since they did live in Northern Ireland, for a time, and we're talking about, the Irish at Gettysburg, so we'll talk a little bit about them. But the Great Conewaga Presbyterian Church Cemetery, there's a guy who died in 1741 buried there. James Ross. And of course, on his grave is a hand with a sword, and you can see, you might not realize that's what it is, but it's cut off. It's the Red Hand of Ulster. And anytime I have an opportunity to tell the story, I just put it in my show and tell it. I love to tell this story to kids. But the Red Hand of Ulster is a Scotch-Irish folk tale. In other words, it's not true. But basically, the fable or tale is used to tell a story. And basically, and there's different versions of the story, and if you want to read all the different versions of it, you can get online and put in the Red Hand of Ulster. But basically, the gist of the story is there's two groups of people, two clans that were fighting over a piece of land in Northern Ireland. And because there was bloodshed between the two families, they decided to settle their differences peaceably. So each family had a representative, and they went through a series of trials, and whichever representative would win the contest at the end, that family would claim this piece of land in Northern Ireland. So as they went through the trials, they got to the last one, and both representatives, they were tied. And so there was one last feat of strength, and it was a contest of rowing. And some versions of the story, they're rowing across the lake. I think in one version, it's the North Sea. And basically, the family who touched land first would win the contest. So it came down to the end, and one of the family members was just way ahead of the other one, and it was obvious that he was going to win. And the man who was going to lose looked over at his family on the shore and saw how upset they were and realized that he couldn't let his family down. So he pulled out his sword, he cut off his hand, and he threw it ashore ahead of the other family. And so the point of the story is that this man cared about his family so much that he was willing to sacrifice his hand for his country. And it's the deeper meaning is that in war, that you're willing to lay down your life for the protection of your family. And this is the motif on the monument for the 20th New York State Militia on the first day's battlefield, the 80th New York, what we call the Ulster Guard from Ulster County, New York. And of course, Ulster being a province in Northern Ireland. So you see that around. And so in Adams County, you can go to various graveyards and you can see this symbol on the tombstones of the early settlers of this area that are from, this area of Northern Ireland. And there are cemeteries in our county that are filled with Revolutionary War patriots. And on my bus trip next week, I'm going to hit some cemeteries around the county that have plaques that highlight the men from the American Revolution that are buried in our various cemeteries. And especially in the the western part of the county, we have a mixture of Scotch, Irish, and Irish. So besides the predominantly Germans that settled in the southeastern part of the county and predominantly Scotch Irish that settled in the central and western part of the county, we did have other groups. We had English Quakers that came in here early on, and we had Marylanders that were coming up from the south. And, prior to there being a firm Mason-Dixon line and Maryland believing that they could settle in this area, Irish from Maryland were coming up into this area. And of course, there was a Catholic presence in the area of McSherrystown, where we have, Conewaga settlement and the Basilica and the Catholic Church. So there were Catholics in the area there, and a lot of Irish came in as early as 1720 and 1730. And English came in there. And then, of course, over in the area near Fairfield, which is predominantly Scotch-Irish, we also had Charles Carroll and Carroll's Delight, and it was also settled with Irish. So some of the Irishmen that moved into the area joined the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians and went to church with them. But early on, there was a Catholic church in Emmitsburg, and eventually there was a Catholic church over in Fairfield. So we had Irish Catholics and German Catholics mixed in with the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. I wanted to mention that, speaking of Eastern Adams County, this is Oxford Township. By 1846, and we know that from the local newspaper, there's a village called Irishtown between Hanover and New Oxford. And Irishtown is still there today. They have the green fire engines. And in Gettysburg, we don't have as many Irish-born settlers, but we do have them throughout the county. I was just reading an article about Irishtown, in which somebody went to interview them about the history of their area, and the guy interviewed who lives there said he didn't know of anybody who was Irish that lived in Irishtown. So I guess today there's no real Irish in Irishtown, but we have a little village called that. And it's not an incorporated borough or anything like that. It's just part of Oxford Township. But the fire department's from the 1930s. It has the green fire engines. Now, there is a Catholic church in Gettysburg in the 1820s. And the Catholic Church was on South Washington Street. And it wasn't until the 1850s, I think 1853, they rebuilt the Catholic church on West High Street and St. Francis Xavier Roman Catholic Church. And there was a cemetery around the church on South Washington Street. And, you read the newspaper every once in a while, they would find bodies along South Washington Street. There's a modern house that sits right on top of where the cemetery was today. I'm very fond of stopping when I'm walking by, and if there's somebody in the yard saying, there's a cemetery under your house, right? I love doing that. So I don't know if they've seen Poltergeist or not. But, so we did have a Catholic church in the area. Now, the Catholics, of course, could be German Catholics, could be Irish Catholics, or, it could be, we had some of the early African-American community. There were Catholics among that community that attended that congregation. But the Irish-born people in this area at the time of the Civil War are few and far between. And I'm sure you're wondering why this guy's up here. But say occurs between like 1845 to 1852 in Ireland, caused by a potato blight, led to widespread starvation and disease, prompting a mass immigration of Irish people, many who sought refuge here in the United States. During the famine years, nearly 2 million Irish people emigrated, about 500,000 of them settling in the United States. 70,000 Irish came to Baltimore alone from like 1850 into the early 1860s. And the Irish started to come into Baltimore in great numbers following the establishment of the B&O Railroad and working along the railroad from Baltimore. And because there were so many immigrants, there was an anti-Irish movement. And, Adams County is kind of interesting in it seems like the county, as opposed to the state of Pennsylvania, always seemed to go against the grain. According to the 1886 history of Adams County, the federal party was eventually the Whig Party, and in all its names and changes, it held power and mastery in the county until 1856, when that remarkable political episode know-nothingism spread over the country. That sealed the fate of the Whig Party in Adams County and gave rise to the democracy, or the Democratic Party. And according to another local historian, the know-nothings turned things topsy-turvy. Adams, for more than half a century, had been in a succession, federal, anti-Masonic, and Whig, and it just sort of flopped because of this collapse of the Whig Party. So during the 1840s and 50s, there was this massive influx of Irish and German immigrants. And as a result, the Catholics had become a powerful minority. Alarmed by these growing figures in our area, the nativists rallied for political action. And this eventually developed into what we refer to as the American Party. Members voted to, they vowed to vote for no one except native-born Protestants for public office. When questioned by others, they were to respond, "I know nothing," just like Schultz on Hogan's Heroes. And because of this, they became known as the Know-Nothings. They were anti-foreign, they were anti-Catholic. I wrote down here, I'm sure it's just me saying this, super patriots. And he adopted the slogan, "America must rule America." And the American Party had took deep root in Gettysburg. Among its prominent members were David Beeler, Edward Fahnestock, David Kendallhart, David Wills. And much of the support grew out of the strength that this area had with the anti-Masonic Party as early as Thaddeus Stevens, when he and his friends had their own paper here. And then they turned into the Temperance Party. And then the Temperance Party eventually turned into the Know-Nothings. And of course, when the Irish and Germans started coming into the United States in the early, the 1840s and 50s, they brought their drinking habits with them. In 1855, the American Party swept the Gettysburg borough elections, and John Burns was the American Party candidate for constable. And what's really interesting is I found lectures where John Burns is actually giving a lecture to the Sons of the Temperance, a group of young people who vow not to drink. And his topic in the newspaper said was the principles of Americanism. Now, I should tell you, all this I wrote in something that I did on local politics, and I wrote it about 20 years ago. So this, and I think reading the newspapers, I was shocked by the anti-Catholic feelings that were scouring the country at that time. And you might know that there were attacks on Catholic churches, and they were burned. And I think there was a suspicion that Catholics were more aligned with the Pope and would follow the orders of the Pope than their new government that they, their new place that they had come into. And that was part of the concern. The anti-German sentiments were just as bad. What's really interesting is that many of the people that lived here, their parents had immigrated here from Germany. But now that they were here, they don't want any more Germans. Yeah, no more Germans, no more Irish. So what's really interesting is in the 1860 Gettysburg Borough Census, only 14% of the people are foreign born, and less than 1% are from Ireland. So we just don't have a lot of Irish people in Gettysburg at the time of the battle, even though we have, in the county, there's a bunch. Now, I would argue that the American Civil War really the Irish really, something happened. What happened there? Okay. The Irish really made a name for themselves. I think a lot of people would suggest that. It's estimated that over 150,000 Irish immigrants joined the Union Army during the American Civil War. And so they served in all kinds of units. They weren't necessarily segregated into one unit or another. They were just, throughout the Army. And of course, Irishmen served in the Southern Army as well. But when the Irish immigrated prior to the Civil War, obviously they're going to settle in a place where there are jobs. And so predominantly the Irish settled in cities in the North, although there were large contingents of Irish in Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, and other, Georgia, other large cities in the South. And you might know that, there's the Irish Brigade, which we're going to talk a little bit about. They had really suffered heavily during the war at other battles. They had been in the Battle of Fredericksburg. They charged the stone wall at the Battle of Antietam. They charged the Sunken Lane. And at Gettysburg, the Irish Brigade was in the wheat field. So there are other Irish units at Gettysburg besides, the Irish Brigade. The 69th Pennsylvania is from Philadelphia. And you might notice their monument is near the angle, and they help repulse Pickett's charge, but they suffered heavily in the attack on July 3rd. And if you go to the Pennsylvania monument, there's a plaque for the 69th Pennsylvania, and there's a star next to the names of the men who were killed in the battle. And often if I have a group of school kids, I'll stop by this particular monument or this particular plaque because it has so many stars with it. And, on average, for every man killed in the battle, 5 are wounded from a unit. So if you imagine, or 4 are wounded, 1's killed. So you imagine 5 times as many stars as you see on that plaque, and you get a really good idea. And you see, of course, on this one, all the Irish names that were involved in the battle there on July 3rd. So, for homework, if you're going to do something, you can go to the Pennsylvania Monument and visit the plaque for the 69th Pennsylvania Infantry and read their names. Also, near Big Round Top is the 9th Massachusetts Infantry, the Irish 9th, and they're part of the 5th Army Corps, but they're made up of a large amount of Irish citizens from Boston. And it's one of the nicer monuments on the battlefield, and it's one that's rarely visited. So it's in that saddle just south of Little Round Top on the slopes of Big Round Top. Now, the Irish Brigade at Gettysburg, of course, like I said, they'd been in other battles. I think that one slide I had was a little bit out of order. But an average size of a brigade at Gettysburg is about 1,500. Brigade is about 5 regiments of 300 men each. But since the Irish Brigade had been in battles prior to this and had lost a lot of men in battle, they have just a little bit over 500 men in the Battle of Gettysburg. And the New York units had really been decimated in those other battles. And I brought some copies if you, I have them downstairs at the front desk, but if you'd like a book on the Irish at Gettysburg, we have a number of copies downstairs for sale. And this book was published by the Farnsworth House about 25 years ago, and it's by Trish Murphy, and she gives kind of an overview of the Irish Brigade at the Battle of Gettysburg and the story of the Irish Brigade that you can read more about. So, in case you're more interested. Oh, and this is a painting here by Dale Gallen of the Irish Brigade crossing the wheat field. I actually really thought that Trish did a nice job on the title, you know, an allusion to the Clint Eastwood movie. And Patrick Kelly is the commander of the Irish Brigade at the battle, so Kelly's heroes. And in the book, you know, there's a map, and you know, I just I thought it would be a real simple map of the fighting the Irish Brigade was engaged in. They were part of Crawford's division of the 2nd Army Corps that was thrown into the wheat field in the afternoon, the late afternoon of the 2nd day of the battle. And they fought in an area we refer to as the Stony Hill. So the units of the Irish Brigade would be the 63rd, 69th, and 88th New York, and then the 28th Massachusetts and the 116th PA. And so they show them sort of on the map there, fighting against Kershaw's brigade. One of the ironies of the Irish Brigade at Gettysburg was the fact that at Fredericksburg, they had charged as a stone wall against Cobb's brigade, and part of that brigade at Gettysburg was Wofford's brigade, which actually charged into them in the wheat field and ended up driving them off the field. And in one of the regiments in Cobb's brigade at Fredericksburg was made up of Irishmen from Georgia. So I don't know if you ever watched the movie Gods and Generals. Oh, it's hard to watch. But in the Battle of Fredericksburg, there's a really interesting scene in the movie where the Confederate soldiers from Ireland realize that they're firing into the Northern Irish Brigade. And so I think, you know, when we talk about the Irish during the Civil War, can you imagine immigrating a few years earlier? Maybe, you know, some of your friends immigrated to New York, maybe, and you immigrated to the South, and you're now fighting against those people that you grew up with and are neighbors of. And there's all kinds of ironies of the men who served in these units. I might mention there's a Gettysburg Daily is a blog site, and they have a series of videos called The Irish Brigade at Gettysburg by John Fitzpatrick, one of our guides. And in those videos, he highlights some of the stories on both sides of the Irishmen at Gettysburg. So I'd recommend that. And, you know, we argue about exactly what the area where they fought was like at the time of the battle that they fought there. We refer to it as the Stony Hill. No one's exactly sure why we call it the Stony Hill, but it's near the Rose Farm, and this would be the Stony Hill at the wheat field behind us. And so the Irish Brigade charged into the wheat field, drove the Southerners back, went up to the top of this rise of ground, and then were counterattacked, and they were driven off the field. The Irish Brigade lost about half of its 500 men at the battle. So although they weren't very many of them, they did lose half of their men here. They fought, you know, in pretty heavy fighting. And, you know, they have monuments at the Stony Hill to mark where the various regiments of the brigade were involved in the fighting. And you can see the 28th Massachusetts monument of the Irish Brigade. And of course, they were from around Boston. And this monument was placed there in, I think, 1885. It was one of the first ones at that location. And if you watch one of our Monuments Mondays video, you'll learn that the placement of that monument really threw off the placement of the other units that fought in that area. And it caused a lot of controversy about the placement of the other monuments. The 116th Pennsylvania from Philadelphia has one of the more interesting monuments on the battlefield of a soldier that was killed along a fence line near the Rose Farm, and it was designed by the major of that unit, St. Clair Mulholland. And then, of course, the Irish regiments from New York They did have 3 separate small monuments or markers they put up themselves, but then they replaced it with a monument to honor the New Yorkers of the Irish Brigade with the Irish Wolfhound on it. And it's got to be one of the more popular monuments on the entire battlefield. So if you give a tour of the battlefield and you drive by it, people are like, wow, what's that? So you have to stop and talk about it. The monument was designed in 1888, and it has, of course, the Celtic cross on it, and it has the Irish Wolfhound. And I should have got a picture of it, but right under where the dog is lying, it says, "This is an exact replica of the Irish Wolfhound, an animal that has been extinct for more than 100 years." And, you know, when I first saw that, I thought, well, that's not true, because there's Irish Wolfhounds around today. And then, you know, as time went by, I read more about it. Now, of course, you can get on YouTube and you can Google this and read and watch videos about it or understand more about this. But yes, the Irish Wolfhounds is extinct. What had happened was an English army officer in the early 1800s, maybe in the 1830s, realized that they were extinct, and he set about to recreate their breed. So he got some Irish deer hounds, and he mixed them and bred them with some other dogs, and he recreated the Irish Wolfhound. See, the Irish Wolfhound we have today is genetically recreated from breeds of dogs that had some vestige of the Irish Wolfhound in them. This is very complicated. I don't know if I'm telling the story exactly right. You can look into it yourself. But what I learned over the years was that statement on there is true. That in 1888, when they put up that monument, there's no Irish Wolfhounds. But now we have a thing that's kind of like an Irish Wolfhound that we call the Irish Wolfhound. Okay. I don't know how many times it's happened to other guys in the room, Jim, but I've had more than one tour where the whole tour is about me driving the Irish Wolfhound to see the Irish Wolfhound monument while the dog's licking my ear and trying to drive. Has it happened to you? Okay. It happened to me a couple times. So people love to bring their Irish Wolfhound to Gettysburg and take them to the monument. But I think the point of the Irish Wolfhound on the monument was that, you know, this was once part of Irish life that is gone. Yeah, this is part of their heritage, yes. And, you know, I love the postcards. I collect postcards, of course, and here's a postcard with a monument on it. Now, of course, the most famous incident associated with the Irish Brigade at Gettysburg is absolution under fire. And of course, it pertains to the chaplain of the unit. Oh, I got it. Okay, make sure I get this under here. Okay, where's my thing? Okay. So, and it's, of course, Father Corby. So, Father William Corby, was the chaplain of the 88th Pennsylvania, one of the New York regiments of the Irish Brigade. And according to an account by a current Major St. Clair Mulholland of the 116th Pennsylvania Infantry, the Irish Brigade was in command of Colonel Patrick Kelly of the 88th New York and formed part of the division. On the morning of July 2nd, the brigade stood in columns of regiment closed in mass. As the larger majority of its members were Catholic, the chaplain of the brigade, Reverend William Corby, proposed to give a general absolution to all the men before going into the fight. While this is customary in the armies in Catholic countries of Europe, It is perhaps the first time it was ever witnessed on this continent. As Corby closed his address, every man, Catholic and non-Catholic, fell on his knees with his head bowed down, then stretched his right hand towards the brigade. Father Corby pronounced the words of abolition. This scene was more than impressive. It was awe-inspiring. And we're fortunate that we have, different accounts of this scene that occurred. And there's this painting that was done in 1891 by Paul Henry Wood. It's called Absolution Under Fire. And the guy who painted it died a year later. He was 19 years old when he completed this. He worked at, he was an artist at Notre Dame. And the original painting today is on display in an art museum at Notre Dame. And you can go see it if you'd like. And there is a video you can watch about the painting, about a 5-minute video online if you look it up. And again, the guy's name is Paul Henry Wood. And it's just quite extraordinary. Obviously, the guy spent no time on the Gettysburg battlefield, and that looks nothing at all like the scene of where this might have occurred. If you read this book, The Irish at Gettysburg, the Irish Brigade at Gettysburg, Achilles' Heroes, I was just showing you. The lady who wrote that, who was a licensed battlefield guide, Trish Murphy, she spends a lot of time in the back of the book disputing the site of where this is said to have occurred. It's fascinating, the whole incident. It's probably, again, it's one of the more famous incidents that occurred with the Irish Brigade. And, there's a monument on the Gettysburg battlefield we'll talk about in a moment, and it's a story that everyone hears when they go on their battlefield tour. Here's my postcard of the Absolution Under Fire scene. St. Clair Mulholland made a big deal how they were under fire at the time that he was giving the absolution, and he tried to have Father Corby awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor because of this incident. Of course, when we look in the bigger scheme of things, it supposedly occurs like at 10 a.m. in the morning on July 2nd, and there may be an occasional cannon firing back and forth, but they're really not under fire by any means. And of course, we debate about where the Irish Brigade would have been positioned in the morning at the time this was done. I think Mulholland writes a couple accounts of it, and as time goes by, his accounts are more dramatic. And in the early accounts, it's clear it's in the morning, but then he moves it into the afternoon just before they go into battle, so you can have them in a slightly different position. And then when they finally do put up the monument, this is St. Clair Mulholland, when they finally do decide to put up a monument, he claims that the statue is on the exact rock that Father Corby stood on when he gave the absolution. So the idea, I think in 1908, there's a reference to this idea for a monument to Father Corby, and a sculptor is hired, a guy named Samuel Murray, and the statue goes in on, let's see, I think it's, I thought I should have had it written down here somewhere, but I don't think I do. What's wrong with me? But it's in 1910. And it's October, if I remember correctly, October 1910. I have the date, I'm sure, coming up here. But they had they brought the monument to Gettysburg. They placed it on the rock. Coincidentally, the rock is right next to Hancock Avenue that had already been established. So that was fortunate. So you can park right in front of it. You don't have to go across the field to see the spot. I think that's why a lot of people question the site of the rock because coincidentally it's right next to the road, and there's lots. I know when Eric Campbell used to do his walking tours of the battlefield, he did an awesome walking tour called Caldwell Clears the Wheat Field. And in that walk, he would suggest a totally different location for where the Irish Brigade was when this incident must have occurred. But it's just a fabulous marker on the Gettysburg battlefield. There was a service at St. Francis in the morning that day, and then they went out to the site, and apparently it was a very cold October day. And there you can see the date. It's October 29th, 1910. And here at the Adams County Historical Society, we have like the only known photograph I've seen of the dedication ceremony. So we have the original photograph. And I just love, the image. Look at the girl wrapped in the flag. And of course, my favorite thing. That is just great. He doesn't care. No. Good. But there's the... Now, you might know that there are two monuments. That they made one, and it went on the Gettysburg battlefield, and there's another monument of Father Corby at Notre Dame. So the same statue. And you probably know the story there. Because, I tell these stories on tours so often that I think everybody knows the stories. But that at Notre Dame, they call him Fair Catch Corby. Because he's calling for the fair catch. My 10th grade teacher, he taught Civil War, and he was a part-time ranger here at the park. He said that the rangers had problems that on the battlefield, people are always putting a wine bottle in his hand because the wine bottle fit in there really well, like Boone's Farm. And he said that one day he went to Notre Dame and he heard there was a statue of Father Corby, so he went to the statue to visit, and sure enough, there was a wine bottle in his hand there too. So I have not seen that in a while. But in 1925. They renovated the front of St. Francis Xavier Church in Gettysburg on West High Street, and he put this new front on with these giant pillars, and Samuel Murray was hired to do a relief of the famous Paul Wood painting of Absolution Under Fire. It's funny, I was looking at my stuff, and I didn't have a photograph of it. So for homework, you have to go down to the Catholic Church on West High Street and walk up. Look, there's even a bench you can sit on and check out the plaque with the Absolution Under Fire on it that was placed there in 1925, so by the Knights of Columbus. And of course, there's, the church has some other interesting features in it, like a stained glass window that highlights the Sisters of Charity from Emmitsburg, nuns that came to the Catholic Church to care for the wounded after the battle. And, the plaque for Absolution Under Fire is over there. And then on this side of the church, they actually have a plaque that highlights the Sisters of Charity caring for wounded on the battlefield afterwards. And you might know, if you don't know this, that there it is. They have the blue habit. They're not it's not like the penguin outfit. I don't know how many other people are Catholic here, but it's the blue and white outfit. So, and this Absolution Under Fire is highlighted in the movie Gettysburg. I thought that was fascinating. They did that. Now the scene doesn't last very long, and they cut away before Father Corby gives the absolution. but they gather and they're playing a song, and General Hancock rides up, behind the scene. And, just from what little I know about the filming schedule, I should mention that, there's Father Corby getting ready to give the absolution. Brian Mullen, who played Hancock in the movie, was one of my best friends when they were filming the movie. He wasn't famous, like a lot of the people that were involved in the movie Gettysburg. And my best friend was the guy who played Fremantle. But he's Irish, and Brian is Irish. And he had just arrived on the set. And when he arrived, he said one of the first scenes he did was they took him out to film this scene with the absolution under fire. So he was really, really excited about this scene. And just, that was his first introduction to the movie, and it really was stirring. So there's been a lot of depictions of the Irish over the years. And here on the left, I think this is, on the right, I know that's J. Paul Strain, and who's the other guy there? I should have wrote his name down if I was going to use this picture. But Bradley Schmell on the left there. So, and of course, I wanted to mention we have, O'Rourke's Irish pub. And you probably know that, we have 2 Irish pubs in town. I think even when I was younger, Irish pubs are very prominent in areas where there are Civil War battlefields. Like at Fredericksburg, you go, there's an Irish pub, and of course there's one in Alexandria. And to me, I just always associated with the Irish pubs with, Civil War reenactors and, Civil War battlefields. Even in Harper's Ferry for a while. I don't know if they have an Irish pub now, but they used to have an Irish pub. But O'Rourke's. Patrick Henry O'Rourke is born in Ireland in 1837. His family immigrated from Ireland when Patrick is about a year old, and they eventually settled in Little Dublin near Rochester, New York. He was an excellent student, and he eventually was assigned to, or given a scholarship into West Point. His classmates called him Paddy. He was a member of the class of 1862. But if you remember the story, because of the need for officers in the United States Army at the outbreak of the war, they graduated the class of 1862 after a stringent 6-week course in 1861 after they graduated the 1861 class. So he really graduated in 1861. And he was first in his class. And of course, on July 2nd, 1863, he's killed leading a charge on Little Round Top. And I think this is a Don Triani's Colonel Patrick O'Rourke sketch where he's leading his men into battle. You might know there's a monument to the 140th New York, the unit that he commanded on Little Round Top, and it has a relief of Colonel Patrick O'Rourke. And you can see in the picture that people rub his nose for good luck. I thought when they renovated Little Round Top recently, I really thought that they were going to do something to restore that. But no. Oh, I was going to say, because I didn't even notice that they restored it. They re-patinaed it, and then very quickly it was unpatinaed. So I'm sure the park would like me to tell you that do not rub his nose. But 2 stories I have to tell with this. First of all, when I was a kid, someone told me that every tour guide before they take the written tour guide test goes to Little Round Top and rubs Patty O'Rourke's nose before they take the test for good luck. And me not wanting to offend the guides in any way, on the morning of my test, I did go to Little Round Top and I did rub Patrick O'Rourke's nose. And I passed the test. But later I found out that the tour guides were laughing at me for doing that. So I think somebody just told me that. I don't even know if that was true. Well, the other thing that's interesting about it is, I have a lot of tours of the battlefield, and you might know that Colonel Patrick O'Rourke, he was first in his class, and of course last in that same class was George Armstrong Custer. And of course people rub Patrick O'Rourke's nose for good luck, even though his luck ran out on Little Round Top. But, Custer had graduated, and 2 years out of West Point, he had hopped his entire class in rank and was a general at the Battle of Gettysburg. How did that happen? I like to tell people that Custer's nose is a different color. Okay, that takes a while. Okay. And then, of course, we want you this weekend to enjoy at least a Guinness from somewhere or go do something Irish, whether you go to the St. Francis Church or maybe the Catholic Cemetery or, O'Rourke's or Gary Owen Irish Pub, the Gary Owen. And you might know that Gary Owen, because have you ever had this question, locals that live here, who's Gary Owen? Why is it called Gary Owen? Gary Owen is a song. The Gary Owen, it's a song. And the song was written in the 1790s. It was used during the Napoleonic Wars. I think it's the 88th Regiment of Foot, a British infantry unit that uses the song. It was first associated in the United States with Irish militia units that were, being organized, were groups of Irish in New York, I think, in New York City. And the 69th New York used the song as their sort of their theme as they went into battle. And you might know that eventually the 7th United States Cavalry uses the song Gary Owen, and it's a favorite of George Armstrong Custer. So, here's what I want you to do. Find it on your phone and play it as you're going into Gary Owen. I'm not sure if the people that work there even know what song it is. If they know, they won't know why you're playing it or what the song is. But yeah, so again, for homework, I want everybody to listen to Gary Owen. Well, thanks for coming to my program, and I hope you learned just a little bit about the Irish.